There is a reason you stopped here. Not because everything in your life suddenly became perfect, not because every problem disappeared overnight, and not because you already know exactly what happens next. You stopped because somewhere inside you, there is a feeling you haven't been able to explain. A feeling that something is ending. A feeling that something is shifting. A feeling that the version of your life you've known for so long may not be the version you're going to live forever. And maybe you've tried to ignore that feeling. Maybe you've told yourself, I'm probably just imagining it. But what if you aren't? What if this moment is less about what you can see right now, and more about what you are finally ready to leave behind? Because the title of this message says something powerful. God just decided your next chapter. And that raises a question. What does that actually mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that tomorrow you'll wake up with every answer. It doesn't mean every obstacle will magically disappear. It means something deeper. It means there are moments in life when the direction begins changing before the evidence becomes visible. The door may not be open yet, but you may already be standing closer to it than you realize. And that is what I want you to think about today. Because perhaps you've been measuring your life by what hasn't happened. You prayed, and nothing seemed to happen. You waited, and the situation stayed the same. You tried again, and somehow ended up disappointed again. You watched other people move forward while you felt like you were standing still. And after enough time, waiting can change the way you think. You start wondering if you missed your moment. You start wondering if the opportunity passed. You start wondering whether your story is simply going to remain the way it is. But sometimes the hardest part of a new chapter is that it doesn't look like a new chapter at first. Sometimes it begins with an ending. A friendship changes. A plan falls apart. A familiar environment suddenly feels uncomfortable. Something you once desperately wanted no longer feels right, and you don't understand why. You think you're losing something, but later you realize you were being redirected. That doesn't mean every painful event was sent by God. Life is complicated, and not everything that happens has a simple spiritual explanation. But faith can change the way you walk through uncertainty. Instead of asking only, why is this happening to me? You begin asking, what is this season teaching me? And that question can change everything. Because your next chapter may not begin with receiving something. It may begin with releasing something. Releasing the need to understand every detail. Releasing the fear that you're behind. Releasing the version of yourself that was built around survival. And maybe that's why today feels different. Not because the world suddenly changed, but because you are beginning to see your life differently. If you've quietly felt that you're standing between an old season and something new, tell me honestly in the comments. What is one thing you feel ready to leave behind? Don't write what sounds impressive. Write what is real. Because sometimes putting something into words is the first time you admit to yourself that you're ready to move forward. And there's something else you need to understand. A new chapter doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it begins quietly, with peace, with clarity, with a decision you finally make, with the courage to stop chasing what keeps running away from you, with the realization that you don't have to keep proving your worth to people who already decided not to see it. And this is where today's message becomes much deeper. Because if God has decided your next chapter, then the question isn't simply, what am I going to receive? The bigger question is, who am I becoming? Stay with this thought, because what comes next may explain why the previous chapter had to last as long as it did. There are seasons of life you understand only after they are over. While you're inside them, they feel confusing. You wonder why things are taking so long. You wonder why certain doors remain closed. You wonder why the same lesson seems to appear again and again. And sometimes you even wonder whether God has forgotten about you. But later, you look backward and see details you couldn't see while you were living through them. You became stronger. You became more discerning. You stopped accepting things you once tolerated. You learned the difference between attention and genuine care. You learned that not every opportunity is your opportunity. You learned that being available to everyone can sometimes mean being unavailable to yourself. And most importantly, You learned that your future cannot be built entirely from the expectations of your past. That's why the next chapter can feel uncomfortable. Because the old chapter taught you how to survive. The new chapter may require you to learn how to live differently. Think about that. If you've spent years expecting disappointment, peace can feel suspicious. If you've spent years being rejected, acceptance can feel unfamiliar. If you've spent years struggling, stability can almost feel uncomfortable. That's why transformation isn't always as simple as receiving a blessing. Sometimes your mind has to catch up with the possibility of something better. You may have spent so much time preparing for things to go wrong that you don't know how to prepare for things to go right. And maybe that's part of what God is changing in your next chapter. Not just your circumstances, your perspective. Because imagine getting the opportunity you've prayed for while still believing you're not worthy of it. Imagine entering a healthy relationship while constantly expecting abandonment. Imagine receiving success while still being terrified that someone will take it away. Imagine finally having peace while feeling guilty for not struggling anymore. The external change would happen, but internally, you'd still be living in the old chapter. That's why growth matters. And perhaps your waiting season wasn't about God refusing to move. Perhaps some of the waiting was about preparing you to recognize what you were asking for. There is a difference between wanting something and being ready to carry it. And sometimes that difference takes time. Maybe you were asking for a door to open when you were still learning how to stop knocking on doors that were never meant for you. Maybe you were asking for clarity while constantly listening to everyone else's opinion. Maybe you were asking for peace while continuing to return to the same source of chaos. Maybe you were asking for a new life, while secretly holding on to the identity created by your old one. This is why today matters. Not because a date on the calendar has magical power, but because a decision can become a dividing line. Before this moment, you were waiting. After this moment, you can begin walking, and there is a huge difference. You don't have to know the entire road. You only need enough courage to take the next honest step. Maybe that step is forgiving yourself. Maybe it's finally having a difficult conversation. Maybe it's applying for something you once believed was beyond you. Maybe it's returning to a dream you abandoned. Maybe it's simply deciding that you will no longer measure your value by someone else's treatment of you. That may not look dramatic from the outside, but internally, it can be enormous. And here's the part many people miss. When a chapter changes, the first sign isn't always that something new arrives. Sometimes the first sign is that something old stops controlling you. The memory is still there, but it doesn't own you anymore. The disappointment happened, but it doesn't define you anymore. The rejection happened, but you don't use it as proof that you're unworthy anymore. The delay happened, but you no longer interpret it as abandonment. That's progress. And if you've experienced that recently, even in a small way, you can share it in the comments. What is one thing that used to control your emotions but doesn't have the same power over you anymore? Your answer might help someone else realize they're changing too. But there is still another layer. Because if the old chapter is closing, how will you recognize the new one? That's where things become interesting. Sometimes the beginning of change looks almost ordinary. You wake up one morning and realize you don't want the same things anymore. You hear a conversation and suddenly understand why certain relationships could never continue. You revisit an old dream and realize you're still carrying it. You walk away from something that once terrified you. You become quieter, more selective, more peaceful, and you start asking different questions. Not, how can I make everyone understand me? But, what kind of life actually gives me peace? Not, why didn't they choose me? But why was I trying so hard to be chosen by someone who wasn't right for me? Not, when will my life finally begin? But what can I begin today? That is a shift, and perhaps that's what your next chapter is really about. Not becoming a completely different person, becoming more honest about who you already are. There may be things you have outgrown, old habits, old fears, old expectations, old versions of yourself that were created because you needed protection. But protection can become a prison if you never realize you are safe enough to move forward. And this is where faith becomes powerful. Faith doesn't mean pretending you know exactly what tomorrow will bring. Faith means you can move forward without having every answer. You can say, I don't know how this will work out, but I refuse to believe that my current situation is the final definition of my life. That is hope. And hope gives you movement. Maybe today you won't see the full blessing. Maybe you won't see the complete answer. Maybe the external circumstances still look almost exactly the same. But something inside you has changed, and that matters. Because every major chapter begins somewhere. A writer doesn't begin a book by knowing every sentence. A traveler doesn't begin a journey by seeing the entire road. And you don't have to understand your entire future before taking your next step. This is where the title becomes more meaningful. God just decided your next chapter. Think of that phrase as an invitation to stop treating your past as a prophecy. Your past is information. It is not necessarily your destination. The betrayal taught you something. The failure taught you something. The delay taught you something. The lonely season taught you something. But none of those things have to become the permanent identity of your life. And perhaps the greatest change today is this. You are allowed to stop expecting your future to look exactly like your past. Read that again in your mind. Your future does not have to repeat your past. You can believe differently. You can choose differently. You can respond differently. You can walk away differently. You can begin again. And if you're listening right now and thinking, I don't know what my next chapter is yet, but I know the old one cannot continue, then you're already recognizing the shift. You can write, I'm ready for what's next, not as some magical phrase, as a personal decision, because sometimes the most important commitment you make isn't to the outcome, it's to the direction. And there is one more thing you need to hear. Don't become so obsessed with the next chapter that you forget to live today. Your next chapter is not an excuse to hate your current page. Today can be imperfect and still be meaningful. You can still be healing, still be learning, still be uncertain, still be waiting, and still be moving forward. That's the paradox. Sometimes you're closer than you think even when nothing looks different yet, and when the opportunity finally appears, you may realize that the real preparation wasn't happening around you. It was happening inside you. But there is one final piece. And this is the part that brings the entire message together. Because what if the greatest change God is inviting you toward isn't simply something you're going to receive, but something you're finally going to become ready to carry? Part 4. Your next chapter starts with this decision, chosen one. Listen carefully. Your next chapter does not require you to have a perfect life. It requires you to stop believing that your imperfect life has no future. You may still have unanswered questions. You may still be waiting for something important. You may still have circumstances you wish were different. But you can begin again before everything changes. That is the revelation. The title says everything changes today. And perhaps the deepest meaning isn't that everything outside you instantly changes. It's that today can become the day you stop allowing yesterday to make every decision for tomorrow. That's powerful, because your old chapter may have taught you fear. Your next chapter can teach you courage. Your old chapter may have taught you to chase. Your next chapter can teach you to recognize. Your old chapter may have taught you to beg for acceptance. Your next chapter can teach you self-respect. Your old chapter may have taught you to constantly ask, why me? Your next chapter can teach you to ask, what now? That question changes everything. What now? What will you do with what you've learned? What will you do with the time you still have? What will you do with the dream that survived everything? What will you do with the peace you've finally discovered? What will you do when the opportunity you've been praying for actually arrives, because maybe this is what you've been preparing for without realizing it? Not just a better circumstance, a stronger version of yourself, a wiser version, a calmer version, a version that doesn't collapse every time something doesn't go according to plan, a version that can say, if one door closes, I will not assume my entire future is closed. A version that can experience rejection without turning it into self-hatred. A version that can experience delay without turning it into hopelessness. a version that can receive success without losing humility, and a version that can receive love without constantly expecting it to disappear. That's a new chapter. And if God is part of your faith journey, you can trust that your life doesn't need to make perfect sense today for it to have meaning. You don't have to force every door. You don't have to chase every person. You don't have to explain yourself to everyone. You don't have to prove that you deserve a future. You can simply take the next step with faith. Maybe today that step is small, but small steps count. Send the message. Start the project. Make the decision. Take the rest. Set the boundary. Open the book. Return to the dream. Pray. Reflect. Forgive yourself, and then keep moving. Because one day you may look back at this ordinary moment and realize, this was the day I stopped waiting for my life to begin. This was the day I decided to participate in my own future. This was the day I stopped asking whether I was behind. This was the day I stopped letting an old chapter define a new page. And perhaps that's why you needed to hear this message now. Not because I can promise exactly what tomorrow will bring. No one can honestly promise that. But because you can choose how you walk into tomorrow. You can walk in afraid or hopeful. You can walk in carrying yesterday or carrying what yesterday taught you. You can walk in expecting disappointment or remaining open to possibility. The choice may not control everything that happens, but it changes the person who experiences what happens, and that person is you. So if this message found you during a season where you genuinely feel something is changing, don't rush to demand proof. Give yourself permission to notice the small things, the new thought, the new boundary, the unexpected opportunity, the renewed desire, the quiet peace, the courage you didn't have 6 months ago. Those things matter. And if you've been waiting for a sign that it's okay to move forward, perhaps this can be your reminder. You don't need permission from your past to enter your future. Your old chapter has already taught you what it needed to teach you. You can honor it without living inside it. You can remember it without returning to it. You can be grateful for what it taught you without asking it to become your identity. And now, turn the page. Not because everything is guaranteed to become easy, but because your story is still being written. If you're ready to walk into a new chapter with faith, write this in the comments. I'm ready for what God has next. And if your words are different, that's okay too. Tell me in your own words what you're ready to begin. Maybe this message will reach someone else who has been silently waiting for the courage to do the same. And when you leave this video, remember one thing. Your current page is not the entire book. Today can be a beginning. Not because the calendar made a promise, not because someone else decided your worth, but because you decided that the past will no longer have the final word. So breathe. Release what you cannot control. Keep what you learned. Trust the process. Take the next step, and let the next chapter reveal itself one page at a time. Because sometimes the biggest change doesn't arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet decision in your heart. I'm not going back. And maybe that is where your new chapter truly begins.